Today's program will feature details of a joint effort between Bethel Lutheran Church and Catholic Charities of Madison to assist homeless individuals in our community by operating Day Resource Center this winter. Speaking on this topic will be Rotarian Jackson founder, president and CEO of Catholic Charities of Madison, and Thom, chairwoman of the Bethel Lutheran Church Homeless Ministry Board. We look forward to hearing from Jackson and Bev, and we have made a contribution to the Rotary International Polio Plus Fund as a way of saying thanks. And just a reminder that there will be hopefully time for questions, and we will have a microphone going around in the crowd to ask questions. So please give a warm welcome to Jackson and Bev.
Thank you, President Michelle. This story begins on Christmas Eve 2015. Pastor Scott Sorensen and Bethel Lutheran Church had been providing a winter day shelter for the homeless for about 7 straight years. Staff and volunteers had poured their hearts out and served thousands of folks over this time frame. Funding was about to end, and as much as they didn't want to, Pastor Scott and his board made the decision to stop providing these services. And on Christmas Eve of all days, in the middle of preaching 8 Christmas services, and on the very night when so many people were coming together to celebrate the birth of a baby without a home, the Wisconsin State Journal posted this article, this headline: "To Scott and the folks at Bethel Lutheran Church, this was a nightmare." Now, within 24 hours, private donors stepped up and kept the shelter open through the winter. But Bethel was left in a lurch. What would the future look like for the shelter, and what would happen to all the people they served? Meanwhile, at Catholic Charities, we'd been having conversations for a couple of years with a lot of folks who are in this room, talking about how we could play a role in Madison with the issue of homelessness. Providing relief to people dealing with homelessness, though, would be a new service area for us. We knew we brought some strengths to the table. 70 years in the community, 400 employees, 1,000 volunteers, and a lot of our work revolved around mental health and trauma, physical and developmental disabilities, alcohol and drug treatment, family counseling, and connecting all of those folks to the right services. Pastor Scott and I are Rotarians, but back then our paths just didn't cross much. Matter of fact, it was fellow Rotarian Dan Stein of Second Harvest who introduced us. Dan thought we'd have a lot in common, and Dan was right, we did. We met on a sunny day in May in Scott's office, and we talked about a lot of things: our families, our organizations, our backgrounds, homelessness, and we talked about potentially partnering regarding a winter solution for a day shelter. When we shook hands an hour later, we had a gentleman's agreement that we were going to get this thing done. A few weeks later, both of our boards approved it. A simple memorandum of agreement is all it took. Fast forward to today, I'm happy to report it's our 8th day of working together. Five-day-a-week shelter at Bethel. So far, so good. But what exactly does it mean to be homeless? It's actually kind of a loaded question. I mean, is it only a person without an apartment or a home? How about a person who couch surfs from friend to friend? Are they homeless? How about the couple who lives in their car? Are they homeless? Or lastly, how about the guy who has a job? He works and he has an apartment for 3 months out of 12. So is he homeless all of the time or just part of the time? You see, the Department of Housing and Urban Development and the Department of Education, they can't agree on a definition, which actually affects funding for those who are providing these services. That means people and children are falling through the cracks, and that's a problem. You might not know that 90% of our homeless population in Madison you will never see. The picture in our mind is the panhandler on State Street. Who you don't see is the person working his minimum wage job, the mother, a victim of domestic abuse, getting her kids to and from school, or a few other scenarios. Well, on January 27th, earlier this year, people were counted. The homeless were counted. They're counted twice a year, and 663 people were counted on that date. Many would say that that estimate is too low, sort of a tip of the iceberg. Bethel might agree. At Bethel in 2015, for the whole year, they hosted 1,300 unique clients. So the numbers don't exactly line up, do they? People really are falling through the cracks. You've seen the numbers on the kids. Those numbers are alarming. Just a couple of notes, 5% of children in Madison schools will be homeless at some point during the school year. 40% will experience homelessness at some point during their entire time across MMSD. That's just not okay. Many of us chalk up a person's homelessness to laziness or personal failures. That simply is not true. This chart shows the multifaceted problem that requires really a multifaceted approach. I mean, there's no one-size-fits-all solution for the child or the teen that's experiencing trauma. The man who has a mental illness and can't get access to his meds, the woman escaping domestic violence, or another with an addiction. It's unfortunate that homelessness is often a story told by statistics. But what I've come to understand more deeply in the last few months is that homelessness is and must be a story of people and faces and individuals. I'm proud to say our community has many wonderful agencies and servant-hearted people who get this job done, and a lot of them are in the room today. They address different aspects of homelessness every single day. My eyes were opened recently on a visit to Bethel when I participated in a book club meeting. Let that register, a book club meeting at a homeless shelter, right? I thought the same thing. A dozen or so men and women, some volunteers, the facilitator and I, all sitting in a kind of a makeshift family room. As Kathy, the volunteer, expertly facilitated a 90-minute session on a book called Dog Tripping by David Rosenfeld. Have you read this? Anybody? That's a funny book, by the way. Story of a family's cross-country adventure from California to Maine. 25 dogs, 3 RVs, and a lot of shenanigans along the way. I highly recommend it. Anyway, we talked about that book for 90 straight minutes. We talked about dog stories. We talked about other travel and family adventures. You know what we didn't talk about? We didn't talk about homelessness. We didn't talk about case managers and social workers and unemployment, sobriety. We had what I would describe as a normal conversation, whatever normal means. We had normal conversation for 90 minutes, just like you and I have, talking about sports and family and everyday things. So for 90 minutes, these men and women had a sense of belonging and family and trust, just like you and me. I'm not sure if there's anything more important than that right there. Like I said, the story of homelessness is about people not statistics. A lady who understands that is Bev Thom. She's chairwoman of Bethel's Homeless Ministry Board. She's volunteered at Bethel for more than 8 years. She's been there when someone has found a job. She's been there when someone lost their sobriety. And she continues to be there to provide hope and love and compassion without judgment. To tell more of the people story, please help me welcome Bev Thom.
Thank you very much. I'd like to share with you 3 vignettes. This may help you understand how people become homeless. Eddie and I were 9-year-old classmates who lived in the same neighborhood. Though he lived just across the street, he was not allowed to play outside his yard. I recall my neighborhood friends and I hiding in the bushes to listen to Eddie's mother yell at him. I will admit that while I was fascinated by seeing and hearing such carrying on, I also felt great compassion for Eddie and wondered how his mother could be so cruel. One day after school, Eddie and I began talking, and we ended up sitting under a sprawling oak tree in our schoolyard. We spent several hours together talking. As a 9-year-old, my counseling expertise was limited, but I hoped that maybe I could help just by listening. Eddie always walked with his head down, and I can't recall ever seeing him smile. We talked so long that day that I came home in the midst of my family eating dinner. I had so much to share with them, but was immediately told by my father that I had to go to bed without dinner because of my tardiness. I was not allowed a chance to explain. For a number of reasons, I will never forget that night. I felt that I had done such a good thing and I wanted to share it, but instead I ended up being punished. While I saw this as a great injustice, I felt comforted by knowing that I had been a friend to Eddie that day. That night may have been the beginning of what I perceived for myself as social justice, and it may have been the underpinning of my moral compass. Fast forward to high school, when Eddie seemed almost invisible. He was not an athlete, nor was he a good student, and he was not involved in any activities. He just was getting through high school. I didn't intersect with him much in any classes or activities. Following graduation, Eddie joined the service, and I soon heard that he committed suicide by hanging himself. I believe that he had never experienced a loving, supportive relationship in his young life, and I have felt sadness at my lack of interaction with Eddie as we grew up. I now know that he suffered terrible abuse at the hands of his mother, verbal, physical, and emotional abuse, something that I was not familiar with as a child. Pastor Laura asked me to urgently talk with a suicidal homeless man. Scott was agitated and depressed, but after a long discussion, I discerned that he was not an immediate risk for suicide, but instead needed a calm, sympathetic ear and someone with whom he could begin to trust. After meeting with him many times, he began to share with me that he was one of 4 children, but the one his mother hated. He was told that he reminded her of his father, whom she was divorcing. A family friend began to sexually abuse Scott at age 4, and that continued for 4 years. And at age 8, his mother informed him that she was sending him to a foster home because she no longer loved him. He was the only child of the 4 being sent away. While in the care of his first foster family, a 15-year-old foster brother sexually abused him. After a number of traumatic experiences in foster homes, he ended up in the care of a man and a woman he lovingly called Mom and Dad. However, the pain of his early childhood was never reconciled, and each time it resurfaced, Scott dealt with it first by drinking alcohol and then with a variety of illicit drugs. This lifestyle remained a constant throughout his adult life until 6 years ago when Scott became a member of Bethel's homeless support group. He has slowly built relationships of acceptance and trust. His presence is valued. He still requires regular mental health care to include appropriate psychiatric medications, but he remains clean and sober and is living out his life as a good man and a valued friend to many at Bethel. I parked quickly near the Walgreens on the square on a cold, blustery November day. I was there to pick up a prescription for another homeless man who was waiting at Bethel, and I was in such a hurry that I decided to chance it and not pay for my parking. As I hurried out of the pharmacy, I happened to notice a man sitting on the concrete, leaning against the building adjacent to Walgreens, and I recognized him, but he didn't see me. I continued to hurry to my car, more worried about getting a ticket than anything else. As I buckled up, I realized that I couldn't face myself if I drove away, so I got out of my car and walked back to where Dave was slouched against the building. He had a long history of alcohol abuse and had had many difficult issues in childhood in foster care. He looked horrible, and it was clear that he was inebriated. I thought perhaps he wouldn't know me, but he did, and he reached out his hand, and I held his hand as we talked. I mentioned that we hadn't seen him for quite some time at Bethel, and I invited him back, but hoping that he would be sober. I asked him if he needed anything, and as tough as he looked, he asked me for nothing. As I drove away, I was sure that that would be the last time I saw Dave alive. The following April, however, shortly before Easter, in walked Dave to Bethel. He was dressed in a clean yellow shirt, his hair was combed, and he was obviously sober and very proud of his new status. I had been so sure that I would never see Dave again, but there he was. And for me, it was honestly a resurrection-type experience. Now, 3 years later, Dave came in just last week to check in, and he proudly informed me that he has been sober for over 3 years. He is still homeless, but sleeps in a furnace room in an old downtown building, and is grateful for that, as well as his sobriety. There is a common thread that runs through each man's life. Each suffered severe childhood abuse. Their coping skills plateaued commensurate with the age and the severity of their trauma. Substance abuse and mental illness were mechanisms to escape the pain of their experiences. Bethel's homeless ministry provides the opportunity to form and nurture trusting relationships, underscoring the power of hope when one is surrounded by a caring community.
Thank you, Bev. You can see and you can hear why we are so excited to work alongside of the folks at Bethel Lutheran Church. We have a unique opportunity to continue that work over the entire winter. Establish relationships one at a time, build that trust, and bring everything that we've learned to the new Day Resource Center that'll open in 2017. To try to explain how excited I am about being chosen to be the operator of this would be just crazy. I couldn't put it in words. The combination of working with Bethel and opening up the center next year has us very, very excited. As you probably are aware, it's going to be located at 615 East Wash, the old chamber building. After renovations, this two-story building is going to be completely done. We're going to gut it down to the studs. You can see what's going on: laundry, showers, short-term storage, private offices for other nonprofits. Probably my favorite part of this. 7 to 10 nonprofits in the first year working alongside of us. Within a couple of years, we're going to stuff as much good in that building as we possibly can. We're taking it a step further. We've identified best practice day centers in the United States, and we're visiting them throughout the winter, because that's when you go to Texas, is in the winter. And we're excited about that. It will not be a dry-looking government building. It's going to be warm and loving and welcoming. There's going to be a lot of color. There's going to be a lot of services, and we're going to need a lot of help. So we are very excited about it. As you leave here today, Bev and I would like you to think about just a couple of different things. Whether it's at Bethel or at the Day Resource Center next year, consider volunteering. We could use your help. Call me, email me, stop me at Rotary, drop your business card in the fishbowl on the table on your way out the door. We'll also need to put together an advisory committee, because that's just what you do. This is good business. Business leaders, community leaders, faith leaders. I could use your experience and your leadership. Please join us. We want to run a great organization downtown. We want to be impactful to the people we serve. And just as importantly, we want to be a great neighbor. Lastly, next time you walk by a homeless person, especially as you listen to Bev's stories, whether they're on the street or in the park or wherever, just take that extra second and engage and see them for who they are. Sometimes just a good morning is all it takes. The partnership between Bethel and Catholic Charities is one that came across with relative ease. Two organizations recognizing a community need, not worrying about egos or territories, and doing something about it. In our culture today, where lines of division can run pretty deep, I hope you are inspired today by a story of two organizations, Lutherans and Catholics, of all groups coming together across a divide to solve a problem. But here's where it starts, right here in this room. Service above self. Isn't that what Rotary is all about? I got to say, I don't know if Pastor Scott and I and Dan Stein aren't Rotarians. I'm not sure this deal gets done. Look around the room today and recall the countless partnerships that have come out of this group. I think we need more of that. Please partner with us as we help our community members struggling with homelessness. Thanks for inviting Bev and I today. I think we've got a few minutes. We could take a few questions if you've got them.
Hello?
There we go.
Karen Kendrick Hands. Public transportation is an important part of our community fabric of resources. And I just want to, how are you going to help the homeless have access and yet not let public transportation become mobile shelters?
Good question, Karen. I can tell you that we're in discussions about how transportation is going to apply here. I can tell you the contract with the county and the city and United Way called for these very specific services that were listed up there. So we're going in knowing that that's what we have to provide, but that doesn't mean it ends there. We know that transportation is critical. And there are some efforts out there right now that have van services, so lots of conversations behind the scenes. way too early to give you that answer, but I appreciate it. I appreciate that you're bringing it up. It's a very good question.
Parker Waller. For a while, I used to think it was a protest down on the square at night about 6 o'clock. And then I eventually realized it was the men about to go across the street to Grace when it opened. And in family medicine, I ran into this a lot, where people went to a day shelter, then the women went to
Salvation Army.
what's in East Washington, sorry. Yeah, Salvation Army, and the men went to Grace. Is that part of the system, or is there a way to prevent or improve the march from site to site at morning and evening? Or I'm not sure what to call it. It just seems unfortunate.
Well, as you know, this is what Jackson and what we are talking about right now is a permanent day center. So people will need to go to a night shelter. And I'm assuming now the Salvation Army has made changes in how they do things for women and families. So I assume that it will be similar for their night shelter. And the city is also considering a new place on Fairchild, and that would be a shelter that would take the place of the 3 current men's shelters right now. The first one is Grace Episcopal. That is the primary shelter. The secondary one is St. John's, right off the square. And then the third is First United Methodist. So I don't know. That's in the works right now.
Last question, I'm told.
I've heard that Housing First works really well for a low-cost solution to homelessness. Do you have any comments about putting people in apartments before they have a job or whatever to get them on their feet?
Absolutely. We are seeing repeatedly that when people have shelter, when they have a place of their own, even if it's just a small room, if it's a place that they can go to every night and have shelter and not worry about where they're going to be, not worry about someone stealing their belongings if they fall asleep under a tree, it seems to be much more effective. So housing is essential for people who are homeless. It really does make a difference in their success.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you so much to all of our speakers today. Just a reminder of the hockey tickets. There are 13 hockey tickets. If you want to come to the podium and put a bid on those, our meeting is adjourned.